Well, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us from across the world. We are ready with yet another very interesting topic. Let me go and talk about that, which is sustainability and mobility, SIG. I will now request our speakers to kindly join in. Warm welcome to all of you, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Uh, by SIG, it means Special Interest Group, ladies and gentlemen. So we are the Sustainability and Mobility Special Interest Group. We inspire entrepreneurs to be imaginers and dreamers. We connect members, invest and incubate in companies, mentor and coach, and give a peer-to-peer sharing of ideas. We are 125 CEOs or managing directors of businesses, and we welcome all Thai Charter members to join our group. Starting today, we as a network are going to host 10 great events in the next 12 months. We have less than an hour, and after my remarks, I'll introduce Nick Boyle, who will speak for 15 minutes. My co-chair, Girja Pandey, will then introduce Sophie Howe, and she will speak for 15 minutes. All the Q&A for both Nick and Sophie will take place after Sophie's speech. The Q&A will be moderated by Prashant Mania, our other co-chair. I would like to introduce the three chairs of our Sustainability and Mobility SIG. Girja Pandey, an entrepreneur par excellence. He was awarded the Public Service Medal by the Government of Singapore. On the sustainability front, his speciality is mobility. He has also written a book on how to do business in India and China. Girja mentors deep tech startups and speaks at forums like TED Talks. My other co-chair is Prashant Mania. He's an award-winning investment banker, focusing on clean tech and sustainability. Based in Mumbai, he's passionate about leaving a clean and sustainable world when he passes on. Last but not least, my name is Dinesh Thamija. I'm also the vice chair of the Thai Global Board. I'm promoting a 348 megawatt solar PV plant and a 4,000 metric ton plant of green hydrogen in Romania. Before this, I was a member of the European Parliament and founded ebookers.com. May I now introduce Nick Boyle, CEO of Lightsource BP. Nick's leadership has powered Lightsource to install 2.6 gigawatts of solar power and has a pipeline of another 16 gigawatts to install. He is at the top of the solar pyramid of the world. Nick, take it away.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for those kind words, and indeed, thank you, Dinesh, for giving me the opportunity to talk here today. I'm in the UK at the minute, sort of 12:30 in the afternoon, so sort of slightly earlier in the day than most of the rest of you, I believe. As Dinesh says, I am the founder and CEO of Lightsource BP, formerly Lightsource Renewable Energy, but I'll maybe give you a little bit of background on how we went from being a company sort of run and operated by myself to now a full JV with the oil giant BP. In terms of introduction, a little bit of background on the company. We actually, funny enough, in November, just last month, we celebrated our 10th anniversary. So 10 years ago, on the 8th of November, 6 of us walked into a small corner of an office in central London. And sort of from those humble beginnings, I have to say well-timed humble beginnings, we've built the business that I'm going to sort of talk about now. I suppose the main catalyst to us setting up originally, like so many businesses in this space, was the UK government feed-in tariff, albeit there's obviously different feed-in tariffs across the world. The point of a feed-in tariff clearly is to drive a business towards, or an industry towards, grid parity, and that was the point of the exercise. So we set up with a lot of different companies at the same time. I think one of the things that sort of set us aside at that time, and it still sets us aside today, is that we were finance people in our background rather than engineering people. So we describe our business as a finance business that employs engineers rather than an engineering business that employs finance. So while everyone else in this market was walking around Cornwall, being the sort of sunniest bit of the UK, knocking on farmers' doors, we were walking around the city of London, knocking on financial institutions' doors to raise money, because at the end of the day, that was, you know, that's the lifeblood of any business, entrepreneurial or indeed established. I think one of the things that is probably worth saying as to why I had a lifetime, 20 years in retail financial services. So why did I move into solar? And I suppose one of the big attractions for me, or the big attractions for me, was the very predictable nature of the revenue streams that it generates. The sun comes up and the sun goes down. I appreciate we know that, but it does so year on year in a very predictable way. Typically 1 or 2% deviation from norm in terms of the if you like, the amount of solar energy that actually can be generated at any particular spot on the earth. So that, for me, along with the government feed-in tariff, so predictable generation and a feed-in tariff, created an annuity type return, which my background in finance told me that annuity, long dated, counterparty rich annuities will sell every day of the week. And I suppose the point for me, the attraction, was that I knew that, you know, a definite 8 or 9% return is much more sellable than a maybe 15% return. And certainly that has been vindicated in the way that our business has grown. So we grew really quickly. We became the largest solar business in Europe just by virtue of what we'd done in the UK. We did about 1.5 gigawatts, I think, in our first 5 years. But unfortunately in the UK, you had to do it the difficult way. We had 300 sites in order to deliver that. Now, if you think about today, our average site is probably 100 megawatts, and we've a 550 megawatt that we're building at the moment. So, you know, we did it the hard way, given the fact that our average is only 5 in those years. So that brought us to sort of 2015, 2016. At that point, we definitely had aspirations to build the business globally, or take the business global. Remembering that, you know, at the same time as we were building our UK business, the solar market had sort of gone through the roof. Electricity generation from solar was becoming the cheapest in the world. It now is the cheapest. It wasn't quite there, but was getting there at that point. And therefore, I suppose the question for any business that wants to move globally from one single country base is, you know, are we a one-trick pony? Are we? Well, our hypothesis was that the systems and controls that we had in place were transferable, you know, to other markets. You know, for us, it was just about, you know, it was about grid, it was about land, and it was about permits. How different can it be? And in order to check that hypothesis, we decided to dip our toe into 2 markets rather than go globally. This was as light source, remember? And therefore, we chose 2 markets that we believed, along with the UK, would give us a fair indication as to whether or not we could actually take the business global. So we went for 2 very challenging markets, and they were the US and India. Because we figured if we could exist in the UK, the US, and India, we could pretty much exist as a solar business anywhere. And we were vindicated very quickly. We found, you know, our hypothesis was correct, that it was very similar, doing business in all of these different countries in solar. And therefore, we made the decision at that point that we wanted to go global, but we were probably, I don't know, a 250 million to 300 million pound business at that point. So while that was great, it certainly wasn't big enough to go global. And so we decided to make the decision that we would look for a minority investor to sit alongside us to basically, you know, allow us to move globally. In order to do that, we took a step back and we said, which industry did we think was the one that had the attributes that, along with our attributes in terms of our skill set in solar, would give us the best opportunity? And for us, the obvious industry was oil and gas. And it's not an immediate automatic bedfellow to sit alongside renewables, oil and gas. But for us, oil and gas companies had been the, you know, the energy companies of the world for the last 100 years. And we didn't think they were going to give up that position lightly. They also had the reach, they had the financial strength, they had the brand and that sort of familiarity, and that would afford us, you know, a leg up, more so than any other industry, in our opinion. And they were also used to constructing large engineering projects in far-flung places. I mean, even more far-flung than us, given that they tended to do things in the middle of the sea. At least we were on land. So for us, it was a case of we went to Rothschild and we said, look, we'd like a minority investor. We want to focus on the oil and gas, which is what we did. And we then ended up getting, I think, 14 bidders, of which 7 were oil and gas. And so I suppose the next question is why did we end up doing a deal with BP? It's always interesting whenever myself and BP, a guy called Dev Sanyal, who's actually an Indian national as well, when we're being interviewed together, everyone's very interested in focusing on why BP did the deal with Lightsource. But equally, from our perspective, it was important too that we decide why we wanted to do the deal with BP, because we had Shell, we had many other bidders that we could have gone with. And I suppose, and I have to say, it wasn't because they're British, by the way. That had nothing to do with it, because we at that point we had global aspirations. But for us, BP just got it. They fitted well with us. I think fit is a really important element when you're forming any JV, even if it's in a minority situation. But for us, they just got it. They understood the relevance of solar. They realized that electricity was going to become an ever more increasing element in the energy mix, with electrification of transportation, home heating, cars clearly, but also in India, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and so on, and indeed buses, because we have a bus business, an electric bus business in India, which I'll go into in a second. So for us, BP was very much the natural fit. So in 2017, late 2017, BP bought 43% of my company for $200 million. But I think the two interesting parts apart from that was that we became Lightsource BP. And in a world that's moving towards power purchase agreements, having those 2 letters at the end of your name just completely metamorphoses the proposition if a company is going to outsource the delivery of, long into the future electricity to them. And BP, as they say, no one ever got sacked for doing a deal with IBM. And then the third element of the deal was that we became BP's exclusive global partner, large-scale global partner, which, given we knew the direction of travel, and that's now been vindicated, we thought was a great position to be in, because you may have seen, hopefully you would have seen, that BP earlier this year announced their move towards becoming net zero by 2050. They set their stall out for 50 gigawatts of renewables by 2030, and obviously, given the fact that we're their partner in that obviously puts us in a lovely position. In terms of how it's gone so far, we did the deal with them in the end of 2017. We had 1.6 gigawatts of pipeline at that point. We now have 16.4 gigawatts of pipeline. Our headcount has doubled to just under 600. We were in 3 countries, we're now in 14 countries. And certainly from our perspective, I think the growth has been incredible. They've been a very supportive partner, and a very important partner for us and indeed our growth, not just because they've been sitting there and they've supported us financially, but also because of the fact that they've been supportive with all of their reach and their connections and also their engineering prowess. And we ended up 12 months ago formalizing our relationship by actually forming a 50-50 JV. So they bought another 7% of us to form, the JV that you now see in Lightsource BP. In terms of what we're doing globally, we have, we'll maybe touch on this later, but we like Dinesh. We're looking not only at solar in the as generated space where we are today, we're developing other areas such as hydrogen, such as other sort of shaped solutions, and maybe we'll look at that in the Q&A. But certainly from our perspective, I think the relationship is a great illustration of how symbiosis between different businesses can actually basically add value to both those businesses. While we were very good at what we did, we needed the reach, the gravitas, etc., that we were afforded by a company like BP. And while they had that, they didn't have the solar expertise to be able to bring them into the, if you like, the new world that solar and indeed other forms of renewables bring. So maybe Dinesh, I'll leave it there rather than go into looking at hydrogen, and maybe at some point I'll maybe touch on our Eversource business in India, but maybe in terms of background, I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Girja, over to you.
You're on mute.
Okay. Good afternoon and good morning to many. This is night in Singapore. I have a great pleasure in introducing Sophie Howe, the Commissioner for Sustainable Development and Future Generations. It's a very interesting designation, and I had the opportunity to hear Sophie on TED Talk, and I found that very interesting that here is a country, a state which is actually looking at future generations and sustainable development related to it. So I think you're going to find it very interesting what Sophie has to say. She was appointed the first Future Generation Commissioner for Wales in February 2016. Her role is to act as a guardian for the interests of future generations at Wales and to support the public bodies listed in the Well-being of Future Generation Wales Act 2015. So there is a very clear legal, and she's working towards achieving those goals. She has been a Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner for South Wales and the only woman in a police commissioner leadership role in Wales. She has tackled violent crime and violence against women and girls, and she has been involved in a lot of reforms of laws and program. She has served as a government special advisor from 2009 to 13 to provide policy and political advice on communities and local governments and housing and community safety. She has served in the county councillor in Cardiff, where she's based, having been elected at the age of 21, and where she was the youngest councillor in Wales. She was also the deputy leader of the opposition for a period, as well as a member of the Children and Young People Scrutiny and Planning Committee. Currently, she is a member of the Wales Committee of Equality and Human Rights Commission and is the chair of the International Network of Institutions for Future Generations. Ladies and gentlemen, I am presenting Sophie Howe.
Well, thank you very much for the warm introduction. It's a stand-in joke in my family that, considering my last role in the police service, that my children used to believe that I kept a taser in my bottom drawer of my desk, and they used to say to me, "It's okay, Mum, because if the politicians don't act in the interests of future generations like you tell them to, you can just taser them." Now, fortunately, I've never had to get to that position, but perhaps there are some people across the world who might think that that was an interesting solution to an ongoing problem of short-term thinking and politicians failing to act in the interests of future generations. So I want to share with you our journey here in Wales. I'm going to share my screen with you now, and hopefully you can see that. So back in 2015, the Welsh Parliament passed a law, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which does a number of things. So first off, it requires our public bodies to take decisions in a way which meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this legislation applies just to the public sector in Wales, but as I'll speak to in a moment, it has ways of permeating into the private sector. It applies to all 44 of our main public institutions, significantly the Welsh Government itself. And when we passed the law, we are and we remain the only country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations, and the only country in the world to have put onto a statutory footing requirements around meeting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So at the point that we were developing our legislation, which really came from a frustration within government and from a number of our NGOs and so on, that although Wales Wales has had a long history in terms of sustainable development. Really, it was still seen as a niche issue. It was still seen as something that the Minister for the Environment would be responsible for, rather than seeing it just as much the responsibility for the Minister for the Economy, how we interact with the private sector, and what we do in terms of building the houses that we build and the infrastructure that we build, and how all of those things are sustainable. And so we held a national conversation with the citizens of Wales, and we asked them, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children and your grandchildren? And they told us that there were these 7 areas that they wanted us to focus on. So prosperity, ecological resilience, a focus on keeping people healthy and well rather than just treating them when they're ill. They wanted us to address socioeconomic disadvantage. They felt that there was the real importance of the language and culture of Wales. They wanted communities to be cohesive and joined together, and they wanted Wales to demonstrate how we were being globally responsible. And each of those 7 wellbeing goals were then set out in law with specific requirements on our public bodies to set objectives to maximise their contribution to all 7 of these wellbeing goals. And when we passed this legislation, the head of Sustainable Development at the United Nations said, we hope what Wales is doing today, the world will do tomorrow. And here's the global infrastructure of our legislation. So at the top then, the UN SDGs, our iteration of that through 7 national wellbeing goals. We track the progress against our goals through 46 national indicators and milestones. As I said, the Act applies to 44 of the main public bodies taking decisions in Wales. We have something called the Sustainable Development Principle, which I'll talk to in a moment. And there are particular duties both on our Audit Commission in Wales and on the establishment of a Future Generations Commissioner. So these then are the 7 national wellbeing goals, which every one of our public institutions have a duty to work towards. And that's quite interesting in itself, because usually what you would get in terms of the goal of a healthier Wales is that's something which is given to the National Health Service to deliver on health impact of the population. But actually what we know is the biggest determinants of health of a population sit in the way that living conditions are derived. They sit in the whether we're living in areas of high air pollution, whether we're meeting our carbon emissions targets, whether people are living in poverty. So actually the responsibility needs to be shared across all of our public institutions to meet each one of these 7 wellbeing goals. And what's also interesting is the definition of some of these goals. So you will see there in terms of our definition of a prosperous Wales, nowhere there is reference to prosperity being around increasing in GDP or GVA. Our definition, which is a sustainable definition, is a productive, innovative, low carbon society which recognises the limits of the global environment and therefore uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change. So recognising those significantly important interconnections between economy and planet, the health of people and the health of planet. Perhaps one could argue connections that have been ignored for too long. And then the legislation sets out these requirements on our public institutions to act in these 5 ways. The minister who took this legislation through our parliament described this as the Common Sense Act, because there's nothing really that you could disagree with in terms of these 5 principles, which isn't common sense. So we must recognise the long-term impact of the things that we do. We must move beyond our silos and recognise the interconnections between different things. We must involve citizens or people who are affected by decision-making in that decision-making process. We must all work together because no one organisation or indeed sector can solve our big challenges alone, and we must seek to prevent problems from occurring. So rather than just focusing on dealing with acute problems, and arguably one of our most acute problems is the climate crisis facing us and the really drastic actions that we're going to have to take within the next decade in order to prevent an absolutely catastrophic devastation to our planet, something which, by the way, we could have prevented if we had acted earlier. Our Act also applies to all functions of our public bodies, so it permeates into their role in financial planning, corporate planning priorities, procurement, asset management, workforce planning, and so on. And then the Act establishes an independent commissioner, myself, to oversee the implementation of the Future Generations Act. And I often say I've got one of probably the coolest job titles in Wales, or possibly the world, because my job, as set out in law, is to act as the guardian of the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And what is the role of a commissioner? Well, my role is to advise and support public bodies on how they implement this legislation, but also to speak out on behalf of those yet to be born, to call out policies and practices which do not align with our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And you can imagine that when we move to a progressive approach like this, my job is very much about unpicking the habits of very many lifetimes. So unpicking the challenges around short-term decision-making, short-term political terms and cycle, short-term budget decisions where people are trying to spend less, which may create problems in the longer term, rather than spending a bit more in the shorter term to stave off those longer term problems. And one of the most significant early interventions that I made, which really showed the power of the Commissioner and the legislation, was around a proposal that the government had to spend almost all of their borrowing capacity building a large stretch of motorway to deal with the problem of congestion. And my question to the government on behalf of future generations was, can you explain to me how building additional roads is in line with our targets to reduce carbon emissions and our goal of a low carbon innovative society within that goal of a prosperous Wales? Can you explain to me how this proposal is in line with our goal of a more equal Wales, when 25% of the most socioeconomically deprived people in this region don't even have access to a car? Can you explain to me how this proposal is in line with meeting our goal of a healthier Wales, where what we need to do is to reduce air pollution? We need to get people out of their cars, cycling and walking, to deal with our obesity crisis. So this is not going to be addressing this challenge. And the government changed their minds. What had been regarded for a long time as a done deal on making this investment in this stretch of road was rejected by the government on the Future Generations Act that they had passed. And there are many other reforms which are taking place as a result of our Act. So our planning policy in Wales has now been completely reformed, with requirements around our national infrastructure being tested against how it will improve social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being and make a contribution to those 7 national well-being goals. Our new transport strategy, published just a few weeks ago, is completely aligned now with our Future Generations Act, with a transport hierarchy which aims to reduce the need for people to travel, because by doing that, in the long term, we will reduce our carbon emissions. We are also likely to be able to focus then on the hyperlocal, bringing communities back together, finding opportunities for jobs closer to home. We've seen record increased spending on the climate emergency since my challenge to the government on how they were meeting the aspirations of the Future Generations Act in terms of funding that climate emergency. And we're seeing the Act roll out to the private sector in the way that the government does business with the private sector, through an economic contract, which requires private sector organisations and businesses to sign up to a contract which focuses around upskilling their workforce in terms of skills for the future, reducing their carbon emissions and promoting the health and well-being of their employees. And we've seen a new approach through that involvement and collaboration principle around social partnership, so bringing together the government, trade unions and the business community to take collective decisions. So these are just a few of the examples of how in Wales we are trying to act today for a better tomorrow, and we believe that it potentially provides a platform, a framework, an example for other countries across the world to follow. Because imagine the difference that we could make to the lives of our children and our grandchildren if all of our policies and all of our decisions across the world were acting in the interests of both current and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Girja, I think you might be on mute. Right. So we move on swiftly to Prashant Manye, and a Q&A starts. Prashant, up to you.
Great. Thanks, Dinesh, and thanks, Girija, so far for moderating. Nick and Sophie, thank you both for the very inspiring speeches. Nick, your passion and commitment to clean energy was clearly visible. And I'm sure that your journey over the last 10 odd years has been, very challenging, but you made it so far and you made it fantastic. We're kind of aware of what you've been doing and what you've been doing to Eversource. I'd like to touch upon Eversource in a minute, but again, thank you very much for that speech. Sophie, first of all, your title is definitely super cool, right? And more importantly, I think it's your mission. It's just so awe-inspiring. I cannot tell you. This is the first time when I heard about it, I was like, this is fantastic. And that every government, every city should have such a position that factors in what we need to do for future generations. So, when we think about this, first thing comes to mind is how do we get this done, right? So Nick, you've been championing clean energy when it was in its early stages. And Sophie, you've been doing this for, since it started. You're the one who started this. So these type of pathfinder initiatives, right, are so difficult. And, our audience is primarily entrepreneurs who come up with new ideas, and they always think about, well, how does this all work? And I know we all have a lot of questions around this. So first I'd like to, ask Dinesh, because I know he has a question that he wants to lob in right there. And so Dinesh, if you could start with the first question for the panel, that'll be fantastic.
Thank you, Prashant. I'm sorry, but it's going to be a mundane question and not the build-up that you've given me. So, Nick, I wanted to ask you. I mean, green hydrogen is such a buzzword these days, and so I was wondering, to what extent do you foresee a place for green hydrogen in clean energy and in the transition to it? Thank you.
That might take half an hour on its own. I'll try and be as quick as possible. Look, the thing that's always been lacking with solar and indeed wind is nobody wants to flick a switch and the light only come on if the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. So the ability to actually make renewable energy or the electrons into something that you can use at any point for any application is obviously the holy grail. And for me, hydrogen basically allows solar as the cheapest form of electricity generation, along with wind, in order to basically run the two alongside each other, and batteries, to be able to actually turn those electrons, turn sunlight or the wind blowing into a feedstock that you can use to fly planes, move buses, move trains, etc. So, I mean, it's whether that's for home heating or whether that's for the applications I just said, and the applications are wide and varied. So for me, hydrogen is one example, certainly a very obvious example where we are at the moment, of if you like the next generation. We've come from a world in solar where it's sort of as generated. I produce electrons, somebody uses it. We've moved to a shaped solution, which is where solar and wind and other applications are added together to give someone 24/7 relief. But then I think hydrogen is the ultimate extrapolation of that, where it actually allows us to change the state of the electrons to allow it to be used in, as I say, buses, planes, and the like. In terms of green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen versus grey hydrogen, green is all via renewables. Green or blue, so green is all renewables. Blue is gas, and then grey is sort of by if you like, the dirtier generation. We are as a company focusing on green. We have a pilot project in Australia, which is just 35 megawatts. We also have a project in Australia, in Western Australia, that is 1.7 gigawatts of solar, 2.4 gigawatts of wind, and 500 megawatts of, so it's about 4 gigawatts in total. That's about $4 billion of investment. That should hopefully come online in 2024. And funny enough, and I promise this was not rehearsed in any way, Our other project is in Wales, would you believe? Who knew? And so we're also looking at basically doing a hydrogen project, in, let's face it, not quite as sunny a country as the likes of Australia, but it illustrates perfectly the the wide applications that the likes of hydrogen creation can basically deliver the world. I mean, in this case, it's actually being added to the gas network, because up to 24% of the gas can actually be hydrogen in order to sort of home heat houses. So for me, Dinesh, it's I think it's a natural progression. Solar and indeed other forms of renewables always needed to get to a point where they could become a feedstock, and hydrogen is, as far as we can see, because of the price of the electricity we can generate, the first of those feedstocks that's coming into the light.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Nick. Dinesh, that was actually a very interesting question. I've been getting a lot of questions on chat on hydrogen, and there's a lot of conferences
That you are doing with the business community, especially the startup community.
Yeah, really good question. I think that in terms of our requirements under our legislation, it really attempts to blow apart, the ways that public sector have worked and worked with other sectors to really take us towards a more progressive approach. So those principles that our public sector now have to adopt. So collaborating and involving others. So this recognition that if the public sector policymakers just talk to public sector policymakers, we are never going to make progress. And actually what we need to be doing is to bring in the innovation from the private sector, the innovation from startups in particular. And so that is the approach that we're taking in Wales. It's certainly not perfect, but as we heard from Nick there, one of the really progressive projects that he's developing is a project which is working in Wales. And we're starting to see that across many parts of Wales, those conversations between the public and private sector and innovators in the private sector in particular are starting to grow in a way which wasn't happening perhaps before our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, where we were really only focused on attracting inward investment from big and traditional players. And now what we are recognising is that actually Wales is a small, progressive and innovative country, and we want to be connecting with those innovators on cybersecurity, on renewable technology. Wales has, we have a lot of wind in Wales. We have plans around a huge scale tidal lagoon, and so some of those areas are the sorts of progressive discussions which are helping us. And when you start to frame that within the context of how do government do the things which are going to help us meet as many of our wellbeing goals as possible, that's when you start to get into a different discussion. So if I give an example of some quite challenging stuff around our tidal lagoon, which gets caught up between the Welsh and the UK government, and I won't bore you with the details there. But the reason why the Welsh government is so committed to that is because that proposal will help us to meet our carbon emissions. It will help us to power homes and take people out of fuel poverty. It will help us to regenerate our communities. It will help to give people decent work, and it would help through that decent work will help to keep them healthy and work, being in areas of lower air pollution and so on and so on. So the issue for us is when you look at things holistically, you have to find ways to engage with those people who have innovative ideas. I mentioned the social partnership approach that is developing in Wales, and throughout the period of us dealing with COVID, for example, the First Minister for Wales convenes on a fortnightly basis a social partnership council between business, trade unions and other members. In fact, in an hour or so, I will be going off to that social partnership council meeting, and we develop policy and test policy jointly together. And that's the sort of approach that I think is absolutely crucial to happen in many parts across the world.
Thank you.
Right, thanks, Sophie. So actually, Nick, you and Sophie both have brought up very interesting points, which sort of begs the question of, how does this tie into a little bit more higher level, right? Because and a more strategic aspect. So Sophie, you have ended your TED talk last time saying, acting today for a better tomorrow. Also on your website, you have the same slogan. So I want to actually ask Nick you a question on this: that what are companies doing to make that better tomorrow happen today? And how does that all fit in with the overall energy mix that you see and the renewed electrification in a circular economy and all of those things that actually we think are going to make a better tomorrow?
Look, it's really interesting, and one of the, well, clearly BP is one of the companies that I'm most familiar with, but you know, they came out in February. There's a new CEO there, Bernard Looney, an Irishman like myself. He's come out with this initiative that they're going to be net zero by 2050. You've also seen other, you know, oil and gas companies make the same statement. But I think, you know, there are other companies in the world. There's a group called the RE100, which is basically a group of large, disparate sorts of corporates that are saying they want to be, you know, net zero emissions by 2030. So certainly from our perspective, the way we see it is that, you know, large corporates are deciding to take the plunge and start transacting, you know, what they can. In our case, it's, you know, by doing power purchase agreements to make all of their electricity long into the future green. So in the last number of years, we've done, I think we've done 3 deals with Amazon Web Services. We've done AB InBev, which is Budweiser beer. We've done Facebook. We've done Google, Apple, L3 Harris, which is which makes you know, guns and ammunition, as it were. So there are a lot of large companies are deciding, look, we're using a lot of electricity, we're a bankable counterparty, and therefore they're making the decision to say, I'm going to make a difference by actually transacting for my electricity and basically taking the bull by the horns and making it green. Now, the interesting thing is that actually it's an excellent business decision as well, because what we are able to do is actually undercut the price of their incumbent power supplier, and we're also able to do something that their existing power supplier is never able to do. We're able to fix the price for the next 15, 20 or 25 years. We've just done a deal, funny enough, with Penn State University in the US and Pennsylvania, to basically supply them for a full 25 years because of the pressure that they as a university have been coming under from their students to go green. So I think there's lots of things that can be done, and there are lots of initiatives that different businesses are grabbing hold of. But for us, as a large-scale deliverer of green electricity, I think we're pushing against an open door with those companies because of what we're able to deliver to them.
Phenomenal. I want to thank you additionally because you've just given us a great session idea, which our audience would love to learn more about these evolving business models. I think the whole business model is changing dramatically, and you can definitely impart much more insights into that for our audience. So you can put down a date for us, and we'll connect with you later. Well, now, you know, flipping to the other side, Sophie, you know, we know that all of these areas are so government dependent. So how will government support this? And I don't mean at the very macro level, right? But more tactically, what support will entrepreneurs and companies have so that they can act upon it today for this better tomorrow? Because we've seen this to be a big problem across the globe in almost everything that we talk about in clean energy and sustainability. So I'd love to, you know, get your thoughts on that for our audience as to what does that mean tactically, not just at the very, you know, document level.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think the point that you make around, I often say that sometimes what happens on the ground doesn't actually reflect the strategy that has been set at a government level. And one of my big challenges to the government is when I talk about the implementation gap, because I think often within governments, within government machinery and the civil service and so on, we see that, we write a strategy and then our work here is done, and we don't focus on the really difficult things that have to be put in place in terms of implementation. And in terms of our Future Generations Act, that's really about a cultural change within right throughout our public sector. So it's about a cultural change with the people who are making decisions in terms of planning developments and built environment developments, for example. It's about a cultural change within our environment agency, Natural Resources Wales, for them not to be just thinking in a narrow lens. And this is where we get to the perspective of that point on integration around our legislation. We need to be weighing up what are all of the benefits of a potential project or proposal, for example, across all of our wellbeing goals, rather than just looking through a narrow lens of one organisation. And that's why this requirement for all of our public bodies to think across all of our wellbeing goals is critically important. But there's a huge challenge in terms of the cultural change that this act requires. So yes, the government have legislated, and yes, the government are increasingly coming on board, but we still have that huge challenge right down to those individual decision makers in our public bodies, in our institutions, who are the ones who are doing the day-to-day interaction with business, and are the ones, if they get this legislation, if they have the mechanics within their organisation to enable them to enact that legislation, they are going to be the ones who are going to be working with the private sector in a collaborative way, because they will be seeing that that's the best way to achieve these goals. So I can't tell you that there is one single fix to this. It's not about writing a document. It's not about training programs. It's about a whole system approach, challenge, the way in which funding flows, the way in which our performance management system is governed, and a fundamental reform of everything that we do in line with those principles in our Future Generations Act that ultimately get us towards it being embedded in the way we do business, right from the top, right down to the bottom in Wales.
Well, being a banker, I love when you say how the funding flows. So, Nick, I want to now go back to you. And, maybe you can talk a little bit more about Eversource and your thought process there, your vision. What do you see as the opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, Eversource, for those of you who don't know, is a 50-50 JV between Lightsource and Everstone, which is a Mumbai-based fund management business. And basically the rationale for, if you like, moving into India in a slightly different way was that we saw India as such a huge market with, Prime Minister Modi's potential that he created so large that we thought we actually weren't big enough in our own right, and therefore we would look for other forms of capital to invest alongside us. We also saw that the barriers to entry in India were somewhat significant, and could we create something that was slightly different, and also something that wasn't multi-country but single country, and simply looked at sort of ESG type initiatives. So we initially rolled it out 3 years ago. We had a 125 million pounds seed capital from the Indian government in the guise of NIIF. We had 125 million from the UK government in the guise of DFID. We're basically increasing that. Our target is to close at $1 billion. In fact, we just got an additional 70 million investment from BP, which is quite interesting, given I'd been giving them so much pressure from the side. They eventually said, this guy's not going to leave me alone until we give him a check. So it's very exciting from a fund management perspective, from a funding perspective. But what we've actually done is it's not just solar. We own 26% of the IANA platform, which is a multi-gigawatt platform. We own 100% of the Radiance platform, which is a CNI platform in India. So, and those numbers aren't included in the 3.6 or 4 gigawatts that we've done ourselves. But as well as pure solar, we also have bought into some e-bus concessions. So we now own some electric buses that have got government concessions, and we're looking to expand that massively to have, I think the target's to have 4,000 electric buses within India, which, Sophie, for you and I sounds like a big number, but for India, that's really just scraping the surface. We also have a battery swapping business, which takes 2- and 3-wheeler batteries, and rather than stopping by the side of the road to get the little sort of liter bottle to fill with the fuel, what you'll actually have is units where you can actually put your spent battery into this machine that's grid connected. It then hands you a new one, and you basically stick that into your vehicle. And then also waste to energy as well as a focus. So for us, the reason why we set it up, and indeed that sort of plan has been vindicated, was that we saw so much opportunity that we thought not only using our own money, but actually using our money as well as other investors' money could afford us a much better market position in order that we could reach a critical mass that was actually relevant for an Indian stage, rather than just be a small player, which we didn't think would get us, the returns that we had planned. And certainly so far, so good.
Phenomenal. I think you guys are doing a remarkable job, is what I understand, on the ground. So our compliments and the very best, so that you can continue doing this great work. And since you talked about Mumbai, Sophie, I have a question for you related to that. I live in Mumbai, and you can imagine that a large population of our city and country today struggles for a better today, not just a better tomorrow. So this question always comes to mind as to how do you bridge this gap between a better today and a better tomorrow, especially from a public a company standpoint, a municipality or what have you, and can focusing on a better tomorrow be a lever to put in plans for a better today? I mean, what is it, and how do you map the horizon for a better tomorrow? Because we would love to see these kinds of things happen here, but these are always the questions. We simply look at, again, a waste to energy plant, and it takes a long time for that to happen. But that's what we need today as an example for a better tomorrow. So maybe you can share some insights and from your experience as to how we can make it happen around the globe. And this is not just for Mumbai, right? It's true for every large, highly populated, dense, city in definitely Southeast Asia for sure.
Yeah, again, a really good question, and one that I'm asked quite frequently. How do we balance the needs of the current generation with the needs of future generations? My starting point would be to say that they are not mutually exclusive, and I don't think that governments across the world can say that they're doing what they should be doing to meet the needs of current generations, let alone future generations. But so my answer to that is we should seek to do the things that have mutual benefits, both to current and future generations. And I'm not even sure that we are actually focusing on that. So in Wales, as an example, one of the things that the government is now focusing on in terms of its investment is improving the quality of housing. And why is that important to both current and future generations? Well, for future generations, we build a house, it's going to be around for the next 100, sometimes 200, sometimes longer time period. So it's important to get the quality of that house right for future generations. It's important that house is carbon neutral or carbon zero for future generations in order to reduce our emissions from housing to help us meet our carbon emissions targets. But for current generations, by doing that, it also means if we invest in those ways, we're going to be creating jobs in local communities to do the energy efficiency fitting into our homes. It means we're going to be taking people who are living in fuel poverty out of fuel poverty because we will have improved the insulation and the energy efficiency of their homes. It means that we're going to be improving the health of current generations and keep the thousands of older people, for example, who have to go into hospital every year during the winter months because they're living in a poorly heated home and so on. So my starting point is let's find the things that are both good for current and future generations. I'm not, I'm not naive enough to think that there aren't huge trade-offs in some areas. But as a priority, let's focus on doing those things, and that requires thought, attention, and a framework for action. And that's what our legislation provides.
Phenomenal. That's very insightful. And you may have people reaching out to you to understand more how this can be implemented in various parts of the world. And I think I'm starting to get pings that we're going to run out of our time soon. So if Dinesh, you or Girija don't have any burning questions, as moderator would like to ask one last question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Phenomenal. So same question to both of you. If you had to pick one most important thing that you would like to do, either for your company, in your case, Nick, company, and Sophie, in your case, for your constituency, what would that be? And the second part of the question is, if let's say we have this conference next year, right? And somebody asks you, what is the trend or what is the next most important thing you would like to accomplish in the next 3 to 5 years? What would those two things be? And maybe you can take 30 seconds on each question and go from there.
Sophie, do you want to kick off, or will I?
Yeah, I'm happy to go, Nick. So I think there are so many huge challenges facing future, current and future generations. The issues around the climate and nature emergency, the impact of the current pandemic, automation, artificial intelligence, what that will mean to the ways that we live and work. big challenges, but also big opportunities around health and so on. So I think it's difficult to pick one issue that you would focus on, which is why I think that you need to focus on the governance and the decision making around all issues which affect current and future generations. So one thing that I would like to see is a rollout of, it doesn't have to be an absolute mirror of what we're doing in Wales, ours is specific to our circumstances, but a rollout of some legal mechanisms in every country of the world and at a United Nations level to require us to demonstrate how we're considering both the needs of current and future generations, and acting and planning for the long term and in a preventative way. So that would be my answer.
Look, I'll sort of wrap in the excuse me, the answer, because I'm not sure it's my want today and it will remain my want tomorrow, and that's that that governments and indeed supporting bodies generally actually practice what they preach by creating an environment where let's take the UK for example. The UK has come out to sort of say that it wants to be net zero, etc. But unfortunately, saying it is one thing. Creating the legislation and the framework, so that private and public sector can invest with confidence in order to deliver that. Because if that doesn't happen, they're never going to deliver. And it's sort of there's a little bit of a sort of dichotomy between what they say and what they actually need to do in order to make sure that it's delivered. Certainly, from my perspective, I sitting in as 50% owned by an oil and gas company, all I would say is if an oil and gas company that, let's face it, pumped stuff out of the ground and stuck a match to it for the last 100 years as their business model, if they can have the penny drop with them that renewables and other green initiatives have to be front and center of what they do in order to create this better future for our kids and grandkids, etc., then I think it's not beyond the wit of man for governments and other, if you like, decision-making bodies to do the same. And from my perspective, that's my wish today. And if you talk to me in a year's time and in 5 years' time, if that hasn't been done, that will continue to be my wish then.
Phenomenal. I really want to thank the both of you for your very candid and remarkable insights. And I say this on behalf of all our audience, of the many people who have tuned in today to listen to this talk. So thank you so much. Dinesh, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, both Nick and Sophie, for your time. It's very valuable, I know, and to spend it with us, we're very, very grateful. Thank you very much.